If you are a parent, a pastor, or simply someone who wants to love this next generation well, you might have noticed how quickly the language around identity and sexuality has been changing. There's these new terms that are popping up all the time, terms like omnisexual and abrosexual and pomosexual. Do you even know what all that means? Boy, it sometimes can feel very overwhelming. And that's why I'm really grateful for the conversation that we're going to have today. I'm Juli, the host of this podcast, and today my guest is Dr. Julia Sadusky. Julia is a licensed therapist who works really closely with young people who are navigating questions of identity, faith, and sexuality. She has partnered with Dr. Mark Yarhouse to co-author the new book, Emerging Sexual Identities. This book is a thoughtful and compassionate and really grounded resource for understanding what's happening in our culture and how we can respond with both truth and grace. In this conversation, we start out by talking about the difference between gender identity and sexual identity. But we also talk about why language seems to be evolving so quickly, the influence of things like queer theory on our understanding of sexuality, as well as how social media is impacting all this. And most importantly, we talk about how to stay relationally connected to the people that you love who might be in the middle of all of this. Okay, here's my conversation with Julia Sadusky. Well, Julia, you and Mark Yarhouse, who is a colleague of yours, recently released a book called Emerging Sexual Identities. And this was sort of like a part two from a book that you all wrote together, Emerging Gender Identities. So I'd love for you just to tell me, what is the difference between those two and where might there be some overlap?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's so good to be back with you, Julie. I would just say, that Emerging Gender Identities was really a book trying to account for the shifts around people's experience of embodiment. So think in terms of how I experience being a body, and then what that means for language and categories around gender in particular. And so there was a shift and an expanding landscape Mark and I were observing clinically where people were using terms we hadn't heard before. So non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid. And we thought if we didn't know what those terms were, how much more so people in ministry and in the church might have felt like they were on their back foot, accompanying young people, especially asking those questions. So that was that first book. And then Mark and I, over the last several years, have really wanted to write a kind of parallel mirror book that really looks more at the categories of sexual orientation and how queer theory and how just shifts in understandings about gender have really impacted how people use language to talk about who they're attracted to. And we were seeing a lot of expanding categories in that as well. And so again, we really wanted to give parents and ministers and really pastors, anybody who cares as a Christian, a chance to really get the lay of the land here more effectively.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. It is a complicated landscape, and you have a list in your book of just different terms that people are using to identify themselves. And a lot of them, I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like, I'll just read a few, like heteroflexible, omnisexual, panromantic, demisexual. It's like, I would have to Google those terms and figure out exactly what somebody is meaning when they say that. And my guess is that even since you finished this book, there's probably a few new terms that have been added. Like, it seems like it's just a constantly evolving process or vernacular. Has that kind of been your experience as well?
Yeah, such a great question. I mean, I think, so many categories of language are shifting over time. I mean, language is a tool to try to communicate, but it can be very overwhelming to, as you said, feel like you have to Google terminology and kind of get to the bottom of it. But I think, what we tried to do in the book is really list out key questions to ask somebody when they share these terms. So to know that these terms exist, to be able to notice your kind of gut reaction to them and manage that as best you can while you're asking more thoughtful questions to understand what a person means when they use the term, which could be different than the Google definition.
So as a clinician, you are meeting with a lot of particularly younger people who are in this exploration process. Do you find yourself hearing terms that you don't know about, even as a clinician who's specializing in this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's what I am struck by when I talk with many parents is they feel so ill-equipped because they don't know what the words mean. And I share with them what I'm saying to you, which is I also don't know what all of these words mean, or I forget, or I confuse one with another. And that's why I like to take the relational approach where I don't actually have to be a walking dictionary, and neither do parents or ministers. I just have to have on hand a couple of key questions that I can ask somebody so that I get a sense for why they're, drawn to the language they're drawn to, how they're using it, how long they've been using it, and what they're hoping to communicate by that word. And so I might say something to a teen like, I'm familiar that there's emerging categories right now. I'm familiar with some of those terms. The word that you're sharing is one maybe I've heard, but I'd love to hear what you mean when you use it. Can you share with me a little bit about that? So you can see even there, I'm bypassing having to be a dictionary, and I'm just inviting them to give me some information in a way that doesn't feel alienating of them or make it feel like I know nothing about this space.
Yeah, I like that. Those are some good questions to be asking. Julia, I would love to even just take a step back and talk a little bit about language in general. There are some people who would feel like these terms didn't exist 10 years ago. They're made up. Kids are using them to describe their experience. Even to ask about the terms they're using or to use that terminology it's like giving up too much ground. Like I'm not even going to go there. And I know that is not your perspective or your approach. And I'd love for you to explain why and sort of what the tension is there.
Yeah, it's such an, important piece of the conversation that I think, I can appreciate that concern. I've had that concern absolutely in my work of to what extent do I use language? To what extent do I not use language? What am I conceding in doing so? And I think there is value in asking that question. For me, in walking with people, I've been really struck by the ability people have to hold two conflicting things at the same time, that I can disagree with aspects of queer theory, and I can use the language of queer theory to talk about queer theory and what it represents to people and what it has meant to people. And I'm not conceding anything by using the word queer theory any more than I would be by defining and using the word moral relativism to talk about a person's perspectives and ideas about reality and absolute truth. And so I think I can hold my perspective on those different matters and use language and categories in actual dialogue with somebody to invite deeper understanding, to invite opportunities for distinction, for me to say, okay, I hear you saying that you're using these words in this way, demi-romantic as opposed to demisexual, and you're kind of distinguishing the romantic component of attraction from the sexual component. And even though I wouldn't say there's endless possibilities of attraction and in the objects of our attraction, I can appreciate that distinction you're trying to make there between romance and sexual desire. And I think there are nuances that I'd love to understand more about that. So again, you can see there, it actually gives me opportunity to not just align with what I can align with and agree with what I can agree on. It also allows me space to say, here's where I wouldn't go. Here's a bridge too far for me. And I think sometimes the fear of being complicit forgets that in conversation, we get to distinguish where we are and where we're not. And it would be a mistake if you simply used language and never gave kind of an account for some of the nuances to what you're bringing to it.
Yeah, it engages the conversation instead of shutting it down. And like you said, you get to choose what you agree with in that conversation. Having the conversation itself doesn't mean that you're complicit in agreeing in everything. So that's a good distinction. You mentioned queer theory. Queer theory is one of the main reasons why we are seeing these emerging categories, I would say not just of sexuality, but also of gender. They are combined in some ways. So that might be a good place to go right now, is just define what is that? What is queer theory? Most of us have never heard of that, and we're a little scared even when we hear that phrase. So what does that mean, and why is that so influential, particularly for the younger generations today?
Yeah, so queer theory is, certainly it could have many definitions. The way we talk about it in the book is a kind of beginning in the kind of ivory tower of philosophy. There were some philosophers that developed this kind of way of approaching reality to say we need to deconstruct norms, that the norms themselves are kind of established by people in positions of power. And those sources of power and authority have failed to really account for the fullness of reality. And so we have to deconstruct those norms, which are purely a social construction by people in positions of power and influence. And so as we deconstruct norms, in this case of sex and gender, we establish a lot more freedom and autonomy for people to live in more authentic ways. And so that has certainly shaped also the way people have related to the idea of embodiment and to biological sex, where it has become kind of its own category, absolutely separate from a person's sense of gender or sense of maleness or femaleness, masculinity or femininity. And even the binary itself, the male-female binary, has been seen as another source of oppression to deconstruct by some queer theorists. And so, we talk in the book about how older frameworks of gay, lesbian, bisexual identity really relied on the idea that these were essential categories. You're born this way, right? And this is kind of a fundamental aspect of who you are. Well, the queer theorist is not that interested in that, and might even say that those terms are kind of trying to align with the dominant culture still in some way. And so the queer theorist says, let's throw out all of those normative models altogether, and let's kind of create a space for people to occupy in kind of these expansive ways. And so the idea of the queer theorist is this is liberating, this is freeing. I certainly have talked to some people who share that that's the way they experience it. I've also met with young people who feel very overwhelmed by the fact that there's not really a normative sense of how they would even know they fit a category in these realms. And so there's a bit of a mixed bag there as far as how young people are experiencing some of that.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. And as you all are listening, you can tell that this is kind of coming off of critical theory as kind of the larger movement that we've seen in discussion over the last 4 or 5 years impacting everything, that the social norms need to be questioned, that authorities are not trustworthy, including religion and the structures of religion and the structures of family. So this is, from, as you explain that, more of an application of that larger principle to the topic of sexuality and to gender, which I think is really helpful. So thank you. I think another piece of this that we have to talk about, it's not just queer theory that is impacting people, but also social media. And you address this quite a bit in your book as well, as that's really a space where particularly teens and tweens and young adults are spending a lot of time. They're seeing these terms show up. And you talk about how they tend to try on language and identities to see if they fit and sort of see how other people give them feedback. Can you explain, maybe even just using a case study or two, that might show the kind of person that you're meeting with and how that feedback loop works?
Yeah, so I think, many people are critical of this idea and concerned about it, right? That young people are kind of performing identity online. And the way I think about it is what I'm witnessing in young people is really a kind of doing online what most of us did in an embodied way in our teen years, where we kind of try on different things. Maybe, when I was growing up, there was that goth kind of trying on, and there's skater boy or girl. Like there was this kind of many ways that young people try on identities. But are there particular challenges and nuances around doing this online in a virtual reality? And so maybe I'll take an example of, let's say, a 16-year-old biological female who is asking questions around sexuality and really, compared to some of her friends, has just not experienced crushes at all. And she's been kind of trying to figure out, what is that about? Why don't I experience attraction, in a really significant way? Like maybe I hear about other people, they're starting to date or be interested in people, and I'm just not attracted to anybody. And so then they come across in social media and through friends, the word aro-ace, so aromantic and asexual. So I experience an absence of romantic and sexual attraction. And this young person who otherwise was feeling like she didn't belong, like she didn't really fit, feels relieved because, oh my gosh, finally, there's a word that might be used to talk about my experience. At the same time, she comes to therapy and she's saying to herself, well, what if that changes? Like, what if in 10 years I am attracted to somebody? What will that mean? Does that mean I was wrong? Does that mean it was a phase? Does that mean, like, my parents think I'm just doing what my friends are telling me to do, right? So it can really be a complicated process where this young person who, again, has never experienced a crush, which could be for a lot of different reasons, now has a framework for how to make meaning out of that. And really in the online kind of domain is sharing, oh, yep, these are, this is how I identify. This is what this is for me. I'm looking for a like-minded community. And that can be a way that plays out. And I think that, again, because it's disembodied in some sense, it can feel confusing for people. What I've heard from young people is, how do I know I got it right? Like, how do I know? And you hear that in the case study. Like, and what if that shifts? And if it shifts, am I conceding that it was for attention or a phase or some of these other criticisms that might come from parents or media or other things? And so what I witness is young people sometimes digging their heels in some of these labels as a kind of act of assertion, no, this is really what's going on for me. Mm-hmm. Or on the other hand, saying, even if it changes, it doesn't matter. It's just a word and I'll just use a different word. So there's a bit of flexibility there of, yeah, this might change and evolve and I'm not attached to it, but what's the big deal in using it right now?
Yeah. If you've been listening to Java with Juli for a while, have you noticed that there aren't any ads here? Well, that's intentional because we want this podcast to feel like a safe place for conversations about God and sexuality. At Authentic Intimacy, we hear every day how much these conversations matter. And if this podcast has encouraged you, challenged you, or helped you feel just a little less alone, would you consider becoming a monthly donor? Your partnership helps us reach more people with truth, hope, and healing, and I would love to have you as part of our team. As a way to say thank you, I'm going to send you a copy of my new updated book, 25 Questions You're Afraid to Ask About Love, Sex, and Intimacy. You can become a monthly partner today at AuthenticIntimacy.com/give, or just look for a link in the show notes. Now let's head to the coffee shop. And so you've got all of these things happening in culture today, whether it's social media or the impact of critical theory and queer theory. You've got exposure to pornography, which I think feeds into a lot of this as well, and the meaning making. And Julia, I don't know about you, but when I think, I'm a lot older than you are, but when I think back to being a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old, boy, I can remember the insecurities and the questions that I had and, not fitting the stereotype of what a cheerleader looks like or, a pretty girl looks like. And if I had this experience that kids are having today of there's nothing to tether yourself to, it's all about creating or finding that perfect label that explains what you're experiencing, man, I can't even imagine where I'd be. So, I think there's a part of us, particularly if you're in the older generation, that you just want to have a knee-jerk reaction to this, like, this is crazy, this is all made up, what are these kids doing? But adolescence and teen years and even young adulthood is such a confusing time. And when the culture you're around is sort of exacerbating that confusion, not giving you any answers, but telling you to look internally, to magnify your experiences and feelings, it's got to just be so disorienting.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of well-founded concern there. I mean, certainly, to have so many identity variables to weigh at a young age is complicated for young people. I often remind young people and adults that orientation, so the kind of enduring direction of my attraction, only is clear over the course of, years, not months, not weeks. And so we really don't have an orientation at 10, 11, 12, 13. We really develop that in real time and in relationships with real people and in our lives. And so I do think there's a reason to be cautious about just kind of swallowing whole this process as a fundamentally freeing ideal. And we try to do that in the book. And then we also try to give voice to the fact that young people will tell us, and I think there's probably something to be said about this, that they do feel like they get some answers from some of the frameworks that are present right now. Like they feel like, to your point, I have a sense of belonging, even in the ways I feel like I don't belong. So I can feel tethered to something real, which is I'm not the only one who's not having crushes at 15. And this word, aromantic, lets me feel a little bit more human in that I'm not so broken or flawed by virtue of this not being there. And so I think that's one thing that's maybe worth naming to help parents understand that I think there are answers that I think we might agree with. You're not broken. You're not fundamentally, flawed because you're not experiencing intense attractions. In fact, that's probably to your benefit when you're 15 to be able to focus on many other important things. So I think we can join with that and align with that. I think where I invite some curiosity in young people is to kind of set aside some of the noise about what that means about the future, to kind of be present to this is what I know right now, and not feel like these terms have to be a prescription for this is the way then I live and move in the world because of this label. There's kinds of, a lot of ways to live in the world, and especially for people of faith, we tend to do that differently from the rest of the world. And so what are the distinctively Christian ways that we explore questions of identity, personhood, meaning, belonging, in a world where these terms may be helpful to an extent and may not fully account for all the questions that are worth asking.
Yeah, that's well said. And, we are talking from a distinctly Christian perspective for most of our listeners on this podcast. And some of, I think, what applies here, and it doesn't just apply to this conversation, but to a lot of conversations about romance, sexuality, marriage, is what are the cultural assumptions that fuel this that are not aligned with biblical assumptions? And you mentioned a few of them, like what is identity and how do we define who we are? This is a relatively new evolution of humanity. These terms, even the terms like homosexual and heterosexual, didn't exist until the late 1800s. And then to get so specific about describing exactly my experience of attractions and romance and attachment. This all is evolving in real time, so how did people navigate questions of identity, particularly people of faith, when sure, they might not have had attractions, or they might have been same-sex attracted, or they might have struggled with gender. How did they navigate those questions before this evolution of language? And is that a healthier, assumption to work towards rather than just accepting the assumptions of our culture that your sexual experiences and desires and your thoughts are such a key part of what defines what it means to be you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And, it's hard to, without being a person who's a historian, it's hard for me to really capture the nuances of how that would have happened if I was alive 100 years ago, for instance. But I can tell you that a place where I see that distinct, I guess, from how we do it today is exactly what you said about the terms heterosexual and homosexual. Those terms were not in play in the 1700s. And so how did a person identify? Well, they usually identified in terms of, the relationships they found themselves in. So if I wasn't in a relationship, I wasn't in a relationship. And if I was, I was. And I think in the realm of, for instance, bisexuality, where a person might experience attraction to both men and women, today, what I see happening in some young people is, on the one hand, wanting to leave the possibility open. Like, I'm not currently dating somebody of the same sex, but, I'm kind of told that that's kind of an option for me. And so should I keep the door open and use this term to kind of keep that door open for myself? Or conversely, if at puberty I was experiencing attraction to the same sex and to the opposite sex, and that was confusing, and I was praying about that, and I was trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian with that experience, and I shared with people I'm bisexual. And then a few years down the line, I meet somebody of the opposite sex, and there can be a whole host of questions of, can I date a person of the opposite sex with this experience? And so on the one hand, again, it kind of allows people to keep their eyes open about attraction and kind of what it means for commitment and for fidelity in a relationship with somebody. On the other hand, it does introduce new decision points almost in the abstract. Whereas I think what was happening historically was there was a practical discernment that was happening around identity and what's happening for me right now in my real relationships. And I'm not going to use language so much as I'm going to step into these relationships and figure out if they kind of fit and are pathways for vocation. And so I think that's one distinction. And then certainly there just was not a scrutiny of any source, not any, but there wasn't as much scrutiny of sources of power and authority, including within the church. And so there was a lot of frameworks for dating and just scripting that existed that were kind of taken for granted realities that don't exist today. And there's been a lot of writing right now about the scripts around dating and romance that just no longer exist. And many people really trying to figure out what is a framework we can operate from that lets us kind of be on the same page. And that's a challenge as well.
Mm-hmm. And so you're talking about not just the confusion that's been introduced by all these questions and these labels, but also maybe what's been lost historically of, what is my road and what do I do with my attractions or the fact that I'm not attracted to anyone. So it's sort of both of them. And as you mentioned, we have seen maybe some healthy deconstruction from rigid ways that we thought about these things. Like, for example, the I kiss dating goodbye, purity culture kind of norms and expectations that for those of us who are committed to the Lord and to Scripture would say those are kind of extra biblical. They're more traditional cultural things that we added on to biblical principles. And so I even think, like, when you're really looking at, parents who are in their 40s with kids that are around 10 or 12 years old, you've got the parent who doesn't want to repeat maybe some of the wounds that they grew up with in purity culture. But then there's this huge, wide open space of gender and sexual identity that doesn't feel right either. And so I'm guessing that you're seeing a lot of that confusion, not just for the kids, but also for the parents and for maybe people in youth ministry that are trying to navigate this well.
Yeah, I mean, I so appreciate why parents throw up their hands and, feel really overwhelmed and cynical and afraid and in the fear, angry. I think I can appreciate that because just what you said is true, that it's such a rapidly different and rapidly changing kind of conversation. And there's a lot of concern about passing on the harms of purity culture and other things that do need to be deconstructed. And so parents, if they're honest, can say, okay, deconstruction of things that are not biblical and not distinctively Christian, let's deconstruct those. Let's kind of strip that away, but let's not throw out everything. And so that's where there's that appropriate kind of caution and protectiveness of norms of sex and gender, of scripting for relationships. But I think many parents feel like, and we write about this in Emerging Gender Identities, like we're up in the airplane at 30,000 feet and we're trying to repair the plane while we're in the air. And then we're trying to teach other people how to fly while we're doing that.
Yeah.
And that really captures, I think, a lot of sexual education today in Christian contexts, where we really are trying to rethink, how do we want to offer this framework? Because even if some of the framework is absolutely true and biblical, the ways that it was communicated to many parents is not something that they would want to pass on.
Right, right. And it sort of shut down any of these thoughts or questions. So if we were to go back in our time machine 30 years ago, the kid who did have same-sex attraction or, wasn't sure what to do with having no attraction, just kept that quiet because they were afraid if they brought it up, people would judge them or put them in a category. And so, absolutely, it's not like, oh, let's go back to the good old days. And I do know, Julia, like as somebody who's a trained clinician myself, when you're in therapy with someone, there's a different posture of really wanting to meet them where they are, being curious about what's going on in their heart. It's a different kind of seat than maybe being a parent or even being a pastor, where it's more of a teaching role or a shepherding role. But I also know that you give wise advice for both. Like it's, that you do need that therapeutic element, but you also need sort of the shepherding element. And I know this is an incredibly complex topic, but if you were to kind of simplify it to a few really important points for a parent or a grandparent or a friend who's walking with particularly kids or teenagers through this landscape, what are some of the key points of advice that you would give?
Yeah, I really do think that for parents, for grandparents, especially of teens, the distinction that I make for you all is that you want to think in terms of developmentally what teaching looks like with a teenager. And I think that's a big piece to weigh here is, how do any of us when we're 15 learn things from our elders? Usually we look to them and we kind of admire something about them. So maybe it's a skill that they know that we want to learn from, or maybe it's a way of being where we feel at ease with them. We feel listened to. We feel like they're paying attention. Or maybe they just seem like they've lived. They have kind of the grit and the street cred that builds a sense of respect. And so I think, we do well with teenagers in all of this to really take the posture of sitting next to them and trying to become an expert on their perspective. Why? Because we're modeling the type of maturity that can hold two things at once. I mean, so many teenagers really struggle with black and white thinking. So many adults struggle with black and white thinking, but developmentally, that would be definitely a challenge and something we want our teens growing out of. And so the question becomes, where do we want them to learn that? They're not going to learn that from social media. They're not going to probably learn that from some of their friends. But their elders, their pastors, their parents, their grandparents are such great role models. So practically, what does that mean? Well, I think for one, I always try to teach parents to honor whatever within the perspective of your teen you can honor and agree with, so that you teach them that skill with you, so that when they're listening to you talk, their first reflex is not arguing and pushing back and challenging and disregarding and dismissing, but actually their perspective is trying to see what's even the sliver that I can agree with here. Because for any one of us, we know that takes us out of a place of defensiveness. It brings our guard down and just creates a posture of learning. So being curious about the other perspective is a skill we want to teach our teens. And the only way we can teach them that is by modeling it when it counts. So that's one very practical step. I think another step is our own formation. You mentioned this earlier, that many parents really don't feel like they know a clear, coherent vision of sexuality because they're kind of deconstructing some of the ways it was presented. And so really being invested in finding resourcing that is distinctively Christian, that addresses sexuality in kind of balanced ways. Because again, we can't pass on what we don't really know. And if we don't have a real sense of commitment to what we're trying to offer, teens are so attuned to inauthenticity, and they'll kind of call our bluff. They'll say, well, you don't even believe that, or what do you mean? Tell me why that is. And they'll kind of poke holes in it rather quickly. And then the third piece, and this is really important and maybe most important for many of the parents that I meet with, is at the end of the day, what they want more than anything is their child to have a relationship with God. And unintentionally in these conversations about sexuality, many of us sometimes communicate to teens that they have to have the Sunday school answer right in order to approach God in prayer, to be involved in church, to be involved in our family conversations about faith, that we really just want the right answer. We don't really want to have to hash it out and be questioned. And so I think growing in our own spiritual discipline of asking God, asking the Holy Spirit to help us receive questions, receive pushback from young people like God does with us. I mean, all throughout Scripture, we see people of great faith wrestling with God. And so with young people, I often signal and invite parents to signal that there's really nowhere else I'd rather them be than in the church asking these questions, because that's the way that God speaks into the answers we come to. And so modeling a faith that is honest about the fact that we don't have every answer to everything and it's complicated, while also really inviting young people to grow in personal encounter with Jesus Christ so that nothing is off limits, including these questions with him.
Yeah. As you're describing that, you're really describing a faith and a love that is robust enough for it to be messy. And to be able to hold that tension with your kids of, the fact that I'm providing this space doesn't necessarily mean that I'm agreeing with all this, but I am agreeing with you that this is a difficult struggle, and I'm not going to try to simplify it. And I'm not going to stop loving you. I'm not going to stop leaning into our relationship because you're not changing. And that's hard to do. As you work with kids and with their parents, it brings up a lot of the parents' issues. The parents' issues of God's letting me down. He's not answering my prayers. I failed as a parent. In what way is this my fault? Do I have to choose between God and my kid? And so there's a lot that's going to come up for you as, a parent or a sibling or a grandparent as you walk with somebody who's wrestling. And sometimes we don't like that tension, so we just leave the relationship, and what you're saying is stay in it. Have a faith in God and a love for your child that's big enough to stay in it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's been really beautiful to walk with many Christian families for, over a decade now, and have some families who I've been meeting with for over the course of many years and witnessing the redemptive power of God's work in their lives, in their families, in exactly these situations that kind of feel hopeless. I think many parents feel powerless. They feel helpless, they feel angry, they feel a lot of guilt, as you mentioned, self-blame. And it's been really beautiful to see just some of the spiritual fruits that come from ongoing obedience to God in showing up in relationships with people he has entrusted to us when it's messy, when it's complicated, and to hear the honest laments of parents who say, gosh, some days it feels really hard to show up in relationship with my loved one. And I hear young people say the exact same thing about mom and dad. Sometimes it's really hard to show up to Christmas and hear this comment or wrestle in this way and kind of really wrestle. But I've seen such deep intimacy come for these families over time, deep trust, commitment, communication, and just faithfulness to the invitation to unconditional love. And it requires a real surrender, but a real dependence on God that I think most of us on some level don't want to have, and on some level absolutely want to be growing in Christ-likeness and dependence on Him for the grace to show up in these relationships in a loving, unconditional way.
As Julia reminded us, we don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to be walking dictionaries or cultural experts. We're actually just called to be people who know how to listen well, who can ask thoughtful questions about a person's journey, and who model a kind of faith that's strong enough to hold tension without walking away. And for those of you who are parents, grandparents, or mentors, boy, this is hard work. It's going to stretch you, and it may even expose places in your own faith or assumptions that need to be challenged. But it's also very sacred work. My encouragement to you is look to stay in relationships, especially when these conversations get messy, because that's sometimes where people experience God's love in the deepest way. If you want to know more, I highly recommend that you grab a copy of Julia Mark's book, Emerging Sexual Identities, and we'll drop a link to that in our show notes, as well as a few blogs and videos that I think you're going to find helpful. Or just stop by AuthenticIntimacy.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time for more Java with Julie.